Hello, welcome to Viewers on BBC One. Britain has a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, after one of Liz Truss's closest political allies, Kwasi Kwarteng, was asked to step aside as Chancellor after being recalled early from a meeting of global finance ministers in Washington. Well, the Prime Minister is about to hold a news conference in the next few minutes amid speculation that her government is about to make another U-turn over its controversial mini-budget last month, which has prompted turmoil on the financial markets. Now, these are the latest pictures of Kwasi Kwarteng departing from Downing Street. The developments come a day after Downing Street insisted its position on the tax-cutting programme remained unchanged. But opposition to the measures from within the Conservative Party itself has continued and indeed has grown. Now, number 10 Downing Street has tweeted in the last few minutes. It says that Jeremy Hunt has been appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. It also says that Edward Arger has been appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and the MP Chris Philp has been appointed Paymaster General and Minister to the Cabinet Office, so moved out of the Treasury. Let's go live to Vicky Young, our Deputy Political Editor. What does all this say about Liz Truss and her fight for survival, really, as Prime Minister, that she has brought in Jeremy Hunt as her Chancellor?
Well, yesterday there was speculation about what she was going to do next, given the huge amount of pressure she was under. And lots of Tory MPs saying, would she throw one of her closest political allies under the bus in an attempt to protect herself? Well, it appears that that is exactly what has happened. But I think there will still be Conservative MPs wondering if that's going to be enough, because this is not the idea that a Chancellor who went out on a limb and did something that she didn't agree with. Ideologically, they are completely at one on all of this high growth, low tax, the mini budget itself. It was all signed off. It was a joint effort. And so I think lots of Conservative MPs will want to know now is it's not about the change of personnel. It's about, well, what has Jeremy Hunt said that he wants to happen if he is now taking over that crucial position of being Chancellor? Is the programme going to change? We certainly think there will be more U-turns to come, and we'll find out about those in the next few minutes. And the one that everyone's talking about, of course, is corporation tax. That brings in a huge amount of money for the government. Liz Truss didn't want that to go up in the way that Rishi Sunak, a previous Chancellor, had said that it should. She wanted to keep it where it is. We think now that that will probably change in order, of course, to try and make the numbers add up. That's why the markets have been so jittery. They looked at the huge amount of borrowing that the government was proposing in order to fund tax cuts, and they didn't like what they saw. So I think the real question now is how far is she going to change that programme? And if she does, as we expect, then really where does that leave her whole reason of being in government? She got voted in by Tory members based on these policies, and it looks like she's going to junk a load of them along with her Chancellor.
Yeah, and I suppose the question, Vicky, is how many of those policies she does junk. I mean, you talked about corporation tax. We've heard from the financial markets are already factoring that in as a given, that will be reversed. So it's a question of what else she does, particularly to satisfy those markets, because that is really at the centre of this whole crisis.
Yeah, and remember that the national insurance cut, so it went up in April. It's now going to go back to where it was in November. That's already been voted through the House of Commons. There was not even really much chat about it because Labour was supporting that. So that one has already happened. The other one, of course, is income tax. Now, a penny off income tax due to come in April. Rishi Sunak, during the leadership contest, said that should come in, but not for another year. The question is she going to go along with that and maybe delay it a little bit? Could there be other proposals? Of course, the biggest thing at the centre of that mini budget was, of course, the help for energy bills. It's a huge amount of money, and that, we presume, is going to stay in place. So that doesn't leave her with a lot of room for manoeuvre. Other people making the point that actually what they are doing is things like the rates at which you pay tax, move into tax and go into higher bands. That is staying where it is. It's being frozen. And what it means is more and more people, as their wages go up, get dragged into paying paying tax in the first place and dragged into paying even more tax. So that does bring in quite a lot of revenue to help maybe fill some of that. But I think people will be looking now to see the numbers, and this goes back to the original problem. They brought forward this mini budget, which was anything but, had huge sweeping announcements in it, but they didn't have that independent assessment of how the numbers added up. They decided they were going to do that much later, and the markets didn't like it, Tory MPs hated it, and that is why we are where we are now.
And just to put it all into context, I mean, she's only been Prime Minister for, a few weeks. She had said that she would persist with her policies even if they made her very unpopular. She would fight through any unpopularity, but here we are on the brink of what appears like she's going to be announcing a pretty massive U-turn.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you can fight unpopularity if you've got several years to a general election, for example. I mean, she's only got 2. The immediate problem she had, though, was the reaction of the markets. She, of course, and Kwasi Kwarteng as free marketeers, wanting markets to do what they have to do. Well, unfortunately, he's been brought down by their reaction to it all. So it's all very well saying you're willing to be unpopular, but then also very unpopular amongst her own MPs. I mean, I've never seen the Conservative Party, even through the incredibly torrid days and last months of Boris Johnson, I've never seen them so despondent, because the difference this time is those opinion polls, which are suggesting to lots of Tory MPs, and they certainly think so, that dozens of them will lose their seats. And that changes the whole political dynamic, because they're looking at this and thinking, well, look, we're going to lose our seats anyway. We've got to do something to sort this out. And one former cabinet minister said to me, look, it's not going to get any better. She's just not up to the job. So even if she changes tack, then they'll say, well, what's the point? Why have we even got her if she's actually just changing what she was voted in to do? So I don't think the trouble is over for her at this point. But I think, even given the incredibly recent volatile times in politics, seeing a government, a Prime Minister and a Chancellor really imploding in this way so quickly is pretty unprecedented.
OK, Vicky, for the moment, thank you, but do stay there. Well, I know you're going to stay there anyway, but we want to talk to you again in just a minute. Still waiting for that crucial news conference from the Prime Minister at number 10 in just a few minutes' time. In the meantime, while we wait for that, let's talk to Darshini David, our economics correspondent. Let's talk about market reaction to what all the developments we've already had, which is the sacking of the Chancellor. But what else are they looking for in terms of stabilisation from this prime ministerial statement we're going to get? What do they want to see in terms of U-turns on that mini budget?
Well, as you've been saying, there's already been a certain amount of reaction in the last 24, 36 hours, Ben, because markets had got wind of this idea we could see something of a U-turn, particularly when it comes to corporation tax. And as we've been saying, what they are doing is judging, not the man at the dispatch box. They don't really mind who is Chancellor. What they really mind about is what these policies are. So is it just that? Could there be more? Because this is less than half of the £43 billion worth of tax cuts that are still on the table. There's as yet unfunded tax cuts. What else could go? There's other measures, of course. There's things like the rules around self-employment and how you pay tax there. There is tax-free shopping, for example. We heard Vicky there talking about the basic rate of income tax. Are those things going to be reassessed, perhaps? But we have got hints from the letter the Prime Minister's written to the outgoing Chancellor that things like the national insurance changes, also that support for energy help, those are going to stay. Now, those cost tens of billions of pounds. So those questions remain. What does this mean for debt going forward? Can she really bring it down, the Prime Minister, I mean? How are you going to fund that? Also, what does this all mean for growth? Because remember, half of the growth plan was about lower taxes might just stimulate growth. And also, one other thing on tack onto the back of that, we heard the Prime Minister, we've heard the Chancellor talking about the fact that if they hadn't done this, we would have been heading for the highest tax burden in 70 years. Well, as it stands right now, before any U-turns, we are still looking at the highest tax burden we have seen since round about the 1950s.
And just in terms of how the markets think about all this stuff, it isn't the tax cuts or the policies themselves. It's more the fact it was all unfunded, that it meant tens of billions of pounds of extra government borrowing for years to come. Indeed.
When we talk about the markets, what we're really talking about here are the bond markets, the way that governments fund their borrowing. And what we've seen is those markets taking a bit of a judgment and going, with this much to be borrowed. It's riskier. The UK has become a riskier bet. We're going to have to pay investors a bit of a premium. The other thing tax cuts tend to do is they try to drive up spending and therefore inflation. And that too you have to compensate for. Hence why we saw those increases in the interest rates on bonds in the way we have done. That is why we have seen the highest kind of rates for fixed-term mortgages since the financial crisis. Now, those kind of rates have come down slightly in the last 24 hours or so. There is still a long way to go before we get to where we were prior to that mini-budget. Hard to think, it's just 3 weeks ago now.
Indeed. So we've got the Prime Minister's statement in just a few minutes. Do you think we'll get an instant market reaction to whatever she says? Is it going to be that quick, sort of immediate?
It depends. Well, quite frankly, Ben, a Friday afternoon is normally when the traders have knocked off for the week and headed home or headed
They've all gone home.
somewhere better. What that tends to mean is you do see fairly volatile movements when the people who are left, because trading is quite thin. And if we get what we expect, what we've been primed for, really, this change on corporation tax, you may not see much. It depends how much further she goes, or if she doesn't go that far. And what other indications we get from her and the new Chancellor about what happens next.
Darshini, for the moment, thank you. Let's go back to Vicky Young in Downing Street. We're just, Vicky, 2 or 3 minutes away potentially from the Prime Minister's statement. To what extent do you think she is now fighting for her political life just a few weeks into her premiership?
Yeah, I think she is. I think the issue about sacking your Chancellor is that you will hope that they can take the blame and take the heat off you. Of course, the alternative to that is she is then left completely exposed. And that is because this is a joint endeavour. It was a joint programme. It's something that they have believed for very many years, and an ideology, if you like, that they came in with, and they were determined to push it through. So she can't say that it was an idea that he came up with and now she disagrees with it. And I think that's going to be what we're looking for here, is how much is she willing to say, well, I'm not going to pursue this any longer. And actually, if you look at the letters that they've exchanged, the resignation letter, both of them really saying, look, we're right in what we wanted to do. The country has got too much tax. The tax take is too high. We need better growth. I suppose she could say, I still believe all that, but the timing's not right. Of course, what most of her MPs would say is, well, we did tell you that and you still went ahead. And I think that's the biggest problem she's got here, is that her rival for that leadership, Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, very clearly set out what he thought would happen if she pursued her agenda. And exactly what he has said would happen has happened. And that, I think, is why we haven't heard from him very much in public. We have some of his friends, some of those who ran his campaign saying all of it, but he has been proved right. And I think it's going to be very interesting now. I've certainly had some ex-cabinet ministers saying to me, well, look, he could come back, he could be the Prime Minister, he could bring in a lot of talented people from across the Tory party, because that's the other thing she's been very much criticised for, bringing in her own supporters, sacking those who she said to their face, well, you were very good as a minister, you were a very good communicator, you were very good in the department, but you didn't back me, so you're out. And that caused an awful lot of bad blood.
Yeah, a lot of stories in the newspapers about how the Tory party feels it's got buyer's remorse. But what about Rishi Sunak? Because we've seen reports that some Tory backbenchers are actually talking about replacing Liz Truss pretty soon with a kind of joint ticket of Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday I had MPs suggesting that. Now, others said, well, look, there's all sorts of problems with that. It's actually not that easy to do that if you've got a Prime Minister who doesn't want to go. I mean, we saw that with Boris Johnson, didn't we? You know, it took virtually his entire government had to resign in order for him to finally decide to go. And if Liz Truss decides that she wants to stay put and carry on, which it sounds like she does at the moment, then it is a difficult thing to do. And also, I think that kind of approach, it involves lots of other people deciding that they're going to put their personal ambition to one side. And I'm just not sure that we're in that place. I just think that there are lots of people in the cabinet now who think that they might want a chance of being the next Prime Minister. And I'm not sure they would want to go along with some kind of Conservative unity government if they weren't involved with it. And I think there's been so much bad blood. There are so many factions because of this churn of leaders. You have all these people, and that's, I think, the attraction probably to Liz Truss of Jeremy Hunt. He didn't serve under Boris Johnson. He hasn't been in the cabinet for 3 years, so he's not involved with all of that. And I think that is possibly one of the reasons why she's chosen him. We may find out if she tells us why she thinks that he's the man for the job.
You talk about the churn of Tory leaders, and actually we've seen the churn of Tory chancellors as well. You just wonder whoever is leader at the time of the next general election, how much damage all of this will do politically to the Conservative Party?
Yeah, and I think that is the overriding sense that I've been getting from Conservative MPs over the last few days. A lot of them think that the damage is done. They think that Boris Johnson, some of the chaos around all of that, did an awful lot of damage, and that this has just compounded that. And it's because it's about the economy. You know, one of the big things that Conservatives have said over the years is we are competent, we're the ones who look after your money, we do things sensibly. And it's a stick that they've used to beat the Labour Party for a very long time. They simply won't be able to do that at the next general election. They have lost that main attack on the Labour Party, and I think that is why lots of Tory MPs are so fearful. I've never seen so many of them almost already giving up on the next election. And again, that's the difference. When we had other Tory leaders deposed, they were got rid of because people thought, well, actually, we can still win the next election. So, you know, Boris Johnson was there waiting in the wings, wasn't he? One former minister said to me yesterday there was a prince over the water waiting to swoop in, somebody that lots of Tory MPs thought, if we get him in, he's going to win us the election. And he did. There isn't that person standing there now to do that. And I think that is why there's so much despondency in the Conservative ranks. Now, of course, there are still some who say, look, it's 2 years to the next election, you can still turn it round. But to turn it round, she is not only junking her Chancellor, she has to have a real think about her entire approach, her entire philosophy, her entire programme for government. So where does that leave her authority? And I think that's the problem she's got with Tory MPs, that they just look at her and they think, well, you haven't been elected by the people to do this. Boris Johnson won the election on a very different manifesto, and coming in and trying to force this through, many of them not willing to go along with it.
Vicky, thank you for the moment. And back to Darshini David as we just wait for this news conference at Downing Street to start, our economics correspondent. Just picking up on what Vicky said, I mean, I suppose there are a lot of people in the city who have traditionally seen the Conservative Party as the party, in their view, of fiscal responsibility. I just wonder how much surprise there has been in the city and financial markets that we had this mini budget with, you know, tens of billions of pounds worth of borrowing required, something they wouldn't have expected from a Conservative government.
Absolutely not. No, the party's reputation as being the party of safe money, and then you get this. Now, I sat on the trading floor during many budgets, and, you know, you could see tiny little minuscule movements sometimes in markets as they poured over the numbers and tried to work out if they added up. This was shock and awe on a major scale as far as they were concerned. They've never seen anything like this. It's just a decade ago, of course, we were talking about austerity, and do you remember George Osborne, the then Chancellor, talking about the need to keep Britain's credit rating, that AAA rating, make sure we could borrow at very low rates indeed in the international market.
Let's go to Downing Street, and here is the Prime Minister.
Good afternoon. My conviction that this country needs to go for growth is rooted in my personal experience. I know what it's like to grow up somewhere that isn't feeling the benefits of growth. I saw what that meant, and I'm not prepared to accept that for our country. I want a country where people can get good jobs, new businesses can set up, and families can afford an even better life. That's why, from day one, I've been ambitious for growth. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the potential of this great country has been held back by persistently weak growth. I want to deliver a low-tax, high-wage, high-growth economy. It's what I was elected by my party to do. That mission remains. People across this country rightly want stability. That's why we acted to support businesses and households with their energy costs this winter. It's also the case that global economic conditions are worsening due to the continuation of Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And on top of this, debt was amassed helping people through the COVID pandemic. But it is clear that parts of our mini-budget went further and faster than markets were expecting. So the way we are delivering our mission right now has to change. We need to act now to reassure the markets of our fiscal discipline. I have therefore decided to keep the increase in corporation tax that was planned by the previous government. This will raise £18 billion per year. It will act as a down payment on our full medium-term fiscal plan, which will be accompanied by a forecast from the independent OBR. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy in the medium term. We will control the size of the state to ensure that taxpayers' money is always well spent. Our public sector will become more efficient to deliver world-class services for the British people. And spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. I met the former Chancellor earlier today. I was incredibly sorry to lose him. He is a great friend, and he shares my vision to set this country on the path to growth. Today, I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country. He will deliver the medium-term fiscal plan at the end of this month. He will see through the support we are providing to help families and businesses, including our energy price guarantee that's protecting people from higher energy bills this winter. And he will drive our mission to go for growth, including taking forward the supply-side reforms that our country needs. We owe it to the next generation to improve our economic performance, to deliver higher wages, new jobs, and better public services, and to ease the burden of debt. I have acted decisively today because my priority is ensuring our country's economic stability. As Prime Minister, I will always act in the national interest. This is always my first consideration. I want to be honest, this is difficult, but we will get through this storm, and we will deliver the strong and sustained growth that can transform the prosperity of our country for generations to come. I'll now take questions. Can I start with Ben Riley-Smith, Telegraph?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Clearly a difficult day. Can you explain to the public why you think you should remain as Prime Minister, given you junked a key tax cut that led you to be elected and got rid of your Chancellor?
I'm absolutely determined to see through what I have promised, to deliver a higher growth, more prosperous United Kingdom, to see us through the storm we face. We've already delivered the energy price guarantee, making sure people aren't facing huge bills this winter. But it was right, in the face of the issues that we had, that I acted decisively to ensure that we have economic stability, because that is vitally important to people and businesses right across our country. Harry Cole.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Harry Cole from The Sun. You were the one that wanted to cut the 45p rate. You stood on a platform to win the leadership of the Conservative Party on a platform to cut corporation tax. You and the Chancellor, the ex-Chancellor, designed this budget together, in lockstep, we're told, at times in secret, the two of you. He has to go because of the fallout from it. How come you get to stay?
Well, my priority is making sure we deliver the economic stability that our country needs. That's why I had to take the difficult decisions I've taken today. The mission remains the same. We do need to raise our country's economic growth levels. We do need to deliver for people across the country. We're committed to delivering on the energy price guarantee, which people are already seeing in their bills. But ultimately, we also need to make sure that we have economic stability, and I have to act in the national interest as Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC.
Excuse the bluntness, Prime Minister, but given everything that has happened, what credibility do you have to continue governing?
What I've done today is made sure that we have economic stability in this country. Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, is somebody who shares my desire for a high-growth, low-tax economy. But we recognise, because of current market issues, we have to deliver the mission in a different way. And that's what we are absolutely committed to do, achieving that stability at what is a very difficult time globally. Robert Peston.
Prime Minister, the former Tory Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has just said that you have totally trashed the Tory party's election-winning reputation for economic competence. Will you apologise to your party?
Well, I am determined to deliver on what I set out when I campaigned to be party leader. We need to have a high growth economy, but we have to recognise that we are facing very difficult issues as a country. And it was right, in the national interest, that I made the decisions I've made today to restore that economic stability so we can deliver, first of all, helping people through this winter and next winter with their energy bills, but also making sure that our country is on the long-term footing for sustainable economic growth. Thank you very much, everybody.
Prime Minister, are you going to say sorry?
A pretty brief news conference there from the Prime Minister, announcing a U-turn there on corporation tax. As you heard, she said it was clear that part of the mini-budget went further and faster than the markets had been expecting. We need to act now to reassure the markets. We have to deliver the mission in a different way, and lots of questions to her from some of the reporters there at that news conference about her own political future. Let's get the assessment of our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, who was listening to that for us. Vicky, has she done enough, do you think, to save her own job and to stabilise the markets?
Well, I mean, we'll have to wait and see whether she's done enough, but that was incredibly brief. She was saying that actually her fundamental mission still stays the same, and she sounded like someone, slightly irritated that the plan hadn't worked. And she's really saying, look, we just did it a bit faster and it went a bit too far, so the markets didn't wear it. Now, I think there are lots in the Tory party, certainly many in her parliamentary party, who think that it is much more fundamental than that, and just getting rid of her Chancellor won't be enough. One former cabinet minister said, well, you can't just sack somebody for implementing your own policy. It doesn't make sense. But the big U-turn there, obviously, on corporation tax, saying that that change, of course, she wanted not to increase it. It was planned to increase from 19 to 25% next April. She said she didn't want it to happen originally. She's now going back to that. And again, this is something that Rishi Sunak, of course, as Chancellor, brought in, and he thought that that would be the way to try to balance the books. It's a big, brings in a lot of revenue for the government, £18 billion a year, she said. And that was really all she said in terms of any U-turns to do with the mini-budget, on top of that other one, of course, where they decided not to cut the highest rate of tax for the wealthiest. And then she said, looking ahead again to October the 31st, that full plan will still be laid out then. And that's when we get that independent, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they run the numbers and they will say, your numbers add up, and yes, you will get growth of this amount or you won't. And that is still going to be a crucial day, because really she's just deferred that. She's actually talked about the corporation tax change as a down payment, but she was very careful to talk about fiscal discipline, fiscal responsibility, about the public sector being more efficient, saying spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. She admitted the whole thing was very difficult. And I think what we need to know, but won't know for a while, is the conversation that she's had with Jeremy Hunt. Interestingly, when he stood in the last leadership race, he was knocked out pretty early on, but he was calling for corporation tax to be cut to 15%. Now, he's obviously changed his mind too. So we'll have to see with a new Chancellor how much the approach is set to change.
Vicky, you mentioned it was a brief news conference. I think it's one of the briefest news conferences from a Prime Minister I've ever seen. About 10 minutes, and only took about 3 questions. But the questions focused on, hang on, this was a joint plan with your Chancellor, who you've now sacked. What does this mean for your own political future? Surely if he's going, you've got to go.
Yeah, and that's the big problem that she's got. Everyone knows this was her approach, it's what she wanted to do. They decided to do it in a certain way. And, you know, there were lots of MPs yesterday talking about how Liz Truss, you know, was compared to Margaret Thatcher in many ways. Margaret Thatcher came and tried to do some very, very difficult, unpopular things, but all of them making the point that what you do first is you get the building blocks in place. So in terms of the approach of Liz Truss, that would mean making sure that you get growth going, then you increase the size of the economy, and then you might have the money to then do the tax cuts that you want to do. You don't do it the other way around, and that has been the major blunder here, really, and that's the point. Liz Truss is part of all of that, so her credibility, her authority, you know, I would say that actually already she had some difficulties with the backbenchers because, you know, and I think in the first round of that leadership contest, only 50 of her own MPs voted for her, so she wasn't the overwhelming choice of her party, and that makes it very, very difficult. It makes it a very, very difficult group of people to govern. There's an awful lot of former cabinet ministers, former ministers, all with lots of experience on the backbenches. And I think all eyes now will be on them and whether they feel that her position is unsustainable and what, if anything, they decide to do about it.
All right, for the moment, Vicky, thank you for that instant reaction. Do stay with us. We're going to cross live now and join the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Labour's John Ashworth, who's on the line. Well, the Prime Minister has U-turned, which is what you were asking for. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied?
Let's be clear what has just happened. Liz Truss has sacked her Chancellor for carrying out the policies of Liz Truss. A set of policies that led to turmoil on the markets, which led to a run on pension funds and soaring mortgage rates for homeowners across the country. On average, £500 more on a mortgage per month for many people. What is clear now is that we have a government in meltdown, and the only party that can offer economic stability and certainty to homeowners across the country, the only party that will be prudent and careful with the public finances and not cavalier with the public finances, and the only party that can grow the economy sustainably and spread prosperity and wealth is the Labour Party. This is clearly a disastrous set of decisions from a disastrous budget. And actually, what we need is not just a change of Chancellor, we need a change of government.
Let me just ask you specifically which measures from the mini-budget should she have changed her mind on that she hasn't changed her mind on? Because, I mean, you supported a cut in income tax generally. You've supported help for people with their energy bills. So what would you like her to have changed in the mini-budget that she didn't announce in that news conference just a few minutes ago?
Well, it was an absolutely disastrous budget and we were pressing her to reverse it. But we've still got the problem that she has no plan to grow our economy. She has no plan to fix our public finances. She has no plan to rebuild our public services. And homeowners are still facing an increase in their mortgages because of decisions that she took. So, of course, look, you know, getting rid of the Chancellor is understandable in the circumstances. But at the end of the day, people are still facing increases in their mortgages because of Liz Truss. It's why we don't just need a change of Chancellor, we need a change of approach and we need a change of government.
But we've seen that U-turn on corporation tax. What I'm asking you is what other specific measures from the mini-budget would you have liked to see a U-turn or a change of heart on from the Prime Minister?
Well, we were pressing for a change of approach on corporation tax. I'm pleased that she's listened to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer on that front. We also warned that it was a catastrophic mistake not to allow the OBR to validate the judgments of that budget because it led to doubts on the money markets about whether Britain could finance her debts. So we're pleased that she's U-turned on that front as well. But I think this more broadly tells you something about the judgment of Liz Truss and that this is a government in utter meltdown. And really, at the end of the day, when you've got a government in meltdown, a Prime Minister whose political future continues to hang in the balance, what we actually need is not just a change of Chancellor, we need a change of government because it's only the Labour Party now that offers economic stability, certainty, can manage the public finances sensibly and rebuild our public services.
John Ashworth, thank you very much indeed. And let's get some reaction too from Ian Blackford, who is the SNP's leader at Westminster and can join us as well. So the Prime Minister, well, she said she was listening, that it was clear that mini-budget went further and faster, she said, than the markets were expecting. We need to act now to reassure the markets. We have to deliver our mission in a different way. So were those all sensible statements from the Prime Minister? Were you relieved to hear those statements from the Prime Minister?
Well, I'm relieved that the Chancellor is gone and that we've seen at least some of the unfunded tax cuts, the reversal of the decline in corporation tax has been taken off the table. But we can't lose sight of the damage that's been done. We've had an absolute cataclysmic time in the financial markets. And the harsh reality of this is that in the end, that millions of people are going to be paying more for their mortgages as a consequence of everything that we've gone through over the course of the last few weeks. And the person that's ultimately responsible for that is the Prime Minister. This was her plan. It was economic illiteracy to think at a time that we needed to make sure that we were supporting people through the energy crisis, that the Prime Minister could embark on uncosted tax cuts. And that's why the financial markets have been in the meltdown that they have been in. But the real damage of this, Ben, is it's undermined the credibility of the UK and financial markets, not just here, but right around the world. And there is now a trust premium that's been demanded by financial institutions that we're all having to pay. And ultimately, the Prime Minister is going to have to accept her responsibility. She will, I suspect, ultimately be removed from office. But this has been a black period for us. We have been living in difficult times that have now been made much worse, quite simply because of the incompetence of the Prime Minister. And that is why ultimately she has to accept her own responsibilities. And I'll say to Conservative MPs that in the first instance have the responsibility, the opportunity to do something, they need to look at themselves, because it's our constituents, all our constituents, that are going to be facing higher mortgage costs.
What do you mean? That they need to? Are you saying they need to bring in another leader?
Well, they have to accept their responsibilities. I want to see an election that, of course, for those of us in Scotland, we can see the shambles playing out. And we were told way back in 2014 when we had the independence referendum that the strength and stability of the UK, well, that's been blown apart. And
do we need to see another Prime Minister, though? I mean, and we've already had, our fourth Chancellor of the year. Do we need to see another change of Tory leader?
We do, because in the end, it's the Prime Minister that has to take responsibility for this. But, to go through a period where we've had 4 Chancellors within a year shows you the shambles that has taken place within the Conservative government. And Ben, we've had a lot of talk, and we heard it from the Prime Minister again today about growth. There's no detail, there's no substance. And if I can contrast what we did, we published an energy plan last week, one that would see our green energy output increase 5-fold, 385,000 jobs created, a platform that would see the opportunities for energy-intensive industries to invest in Scotland. That's the future that we're offering people in Scotland. What we've got is chaos, confusion, and a crisis, a debt crisis that's been created by the incompetence of this government led by Liz Truss.
But the markets were calling for change to the mini-budget. Opposition politicians like you were calling for change, and she has just announced change. She's just announced a U-turn. So surely she's done what everybody was asking her to do.
There are massive problems in the UK economy, and that's been talked about by a number of commentators over the course of the last few days. And the fact remains, if you go back over the course of the last 20-year period, it's been traditional that there's been a premium on UK debt markets, quite simply because of the challenges that the UK faces. We have an enormous current account deficit, and we are going to remain in difficult times, notwithstanding the changes that have taken place. But it's the lack of a plan. The fact that we're outside the European Union, which has caused so much damage to us because of the limits on our abilities to trade. And it's that contrast between staying on this path with the United Kingdom, or those of us in Scotland that want to get on that life raft called independence and back into the European Union, and that opportunity of a green, sustainable future with investment driven into the Scottish economy. And people here will face that choice of what kind of future do they want to have.
Ian Blackford, thank you so much for your instant reaction to that statement from the Prime Minister. And let's get some analysis from our economics correspondent, Darshini David, who's been with me here in the studio, watching and listening to the Prime Minister. What do you think the markets will make of all of that?
Well, to be honest with you, Ben, not much. And the reason I say that is because we were expecting exactly what we heard from the Prime Minister there, didn't we? We had that U-turn on the planned abolition of the rise in corporation tax rates. And at the same time, they have many questions that remain unanswered. So as we sit here and look at where the markets are right now, sterling has dipped a little bit. It is still below where it was ahead of that mini budget. And when we look at the big thing here, and that is the bond markets and the borrowing costs they imply, both for government and for households, they are still quite a bit above where we were pre-mini budget. So in that sense, anxiety is very much heightened. Why is that? Because we didn't have the fundamental questions answered there. We did have some of the money removed from the public sector's tab, that £18 billion worth of cost that the move in corporation tax rates would have cost. But on the other hand, there is so much remaining. There is £25 billion still of unfunded tax cuts. We've still got that energy package. We still don't know how those are going to be funded. We should talk there about wanting more growth. All Prime Ministers want that, of course. But the plan has been slightly diluted today because one plank of that has been taken away. And this idea as well of reducing debt while not cutting the overall amount of public spending, economists are saying that's a huge question mark over that. So where does this leave us? Well, when you look at what's on the table here, you've got companies which are in confusion with a constant change of government policy. You've got a public sector being told they may not have budgets which match inflation, and they're already falling behind in that regard. That's not a basis really for growth. So you can see why economists, markets remain very jittery indeed. The hard and fast answers, we're still having to wait until the end of the month. It is numbers they deal with, not words. And at the moment, they don't have them.
So what more could she have done in that very brief statement from Downing Street and very few answers to the three questions I think she took from reporters? What else could she have done that would have further satisfied the markets and calmed the markets?
Well, we'd go all the way back to 3 weeks ago, Ben. We were hearing back then, analysts saying, show us the money, show us the assessment from your watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility. We are going to get that. We have to wait until the 31st of October. Explain to us exactly how this all hangs together, because what we've got at the moment, those tax cuts, they tend to put more pressure on inflation unless you have these supply side measures. She mentioned them there. They take time to work. So economists are unconvinced. They want to see if the OBR has rubber stamped these. Otherwise, the riskiness to investors of lending to the UK is perceived to have gone up. That is why people up and down the country are currently facing higher mortgage rates than they would have done otherwise.
And I think she said the medium-term fiscal plan is still scheduled for October the 31st, Halloween. In other words, there was some pressure to bring it forward again. That's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. We're still going to have to wait to have the answers to the big questions then. And that may not be the end of it, Ben. We may think that's it, trick or treat night. We can have a look through the numbers and go, that's it. The markets are happy or they're not happy. It is not. It depends whether or not the OBR thinks that the government's plans are credible. It all hinges on that. Credibility is incredibly easy to lose with financial markets. It's very difficult, as we're seeing now in real time, to regain. Let's just have a look at the markets. I think you were saying the pound falling slightly. I suppose the Prime Minister would have hoped to see a huge bounce. Indeed. And, we've heard her and other senior ministers talking about the fact there has been turmoil on global markets. And that is very true. This is a really tricky time for the global economy because of that war she keeps referring to. That has pushed up the cost of living. We're living in a high inflation environment. There are big question marks over prosperity around the globe next year. But if you separate out what's happening on global markets from what's been happening in the UK, you can see we've broken away in some regards. There is that risk premium, the trust premium, as some people call it, that investors have to be paid to hold money in the UK, and that is because the UK is seen as a riskier bet. So no, it's not what she would have liked to have seen, but I think we're a way off from seeing the markets calm down at the moment. But I suppose there is time, isn't there? Things might settle down in the next few days. Well, markets are very fickle, as you know. We do have seen some very sharp movements indeed. They may settle down, but quite frankly, Ben, they're going to want to see the detail. This whole idea that they can just take this leap of faith when credibility has been so broken is pretty unlikely at the moment. So we're likely to see more volatility in the meantime, not less. And I think the key thing to watch here are those bonds, those things that signify borrowing costs. And it's not just households, it's the government's bill as well. Don't forget, as it stands right now, the government is likely to have to borrow almost £200 billion this year to fund its plans. Now, it's already looking at an interest bill on those plans of way in excess of £100 billion next year. It is climbing every time those borrowing costs climb. And every time that happens, that means there's less money left for other things. So quite frankly, this is a government that hasn't managed to get its way out of an economic crisis right now.
But plenty anyway for all those people on the markets, bond dealers, all the rest of them, to take stock, to digest what has happened today on a pretty tumultuous day politically and with these latest announcements from the Prime Minister.
Indeed, and as we were saying earlier, Ben, Friday afternoon, it's normally the time you knock off a bit early on the financial markets, and you like to think that nothing major really happens. But
do you think they would have stuck around perhaps knowing that there was a lot going on?
I think maybe some plans for an early start to the weekend may have been shelved this morning when they saw how things were going on. But what we've seen is absolutely extraordinary. I've not seen it in decades of covering the markets, and you know, it's not the kind of news. I mean, how often in fact, we've never seen a Chancellor do a midnight flit back from the IMF to come back only
to come back and get the sack.
Exactly. So that doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the UK's position within the global markets. I think you find we've got a way to go to regain that, even though we are operating in a very tumultuous atmosphere anyway around the globe.
Darshini, very good to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed. That's Darshini David there, our economics correspondent. Well, let's just recap then on that news conference we've been hearing in the last half an hour or so. Very brief news conference from the Prime Minister Liz Truss, in which she made another huge U-turn on that mini budget from last month, reversing her plans to scrap the increase in corporation tax. The move followed the sacking earlier on today of her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. He is being replaced by the former Health Secretary and Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Well, Liz Truss insisted that she will, quote, always act in the national interest, and said her government will get through this storm. She was asked whether she would resign as Prime Minister, and she said, I'm absolutely determined to see through what I have promised. Labour said the government is in meltdown. Let's have a listen to some of what the Prime Minister had to say.
My conviction that this country needs to go for growth is rooted in my personal experience. I know what it's like to grow up somewhere that isn't feeling the benefits of growth. I saw what that meant, and I'm not prepared to accept that for our country. I want a country where people can get good jobs, new businesses can set up, and families can afford an even better life. That's why, from day one, I've been ambitious for growth. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the potential of this great country has been held back by persistently weak growth. I want to deliver a low-tax, high-wage, high-growth economy. It's what I was elected by my party to do. That mission remains. People across this country rightly want stability. That's why we acted to support businesses and households with their energy costs this winter. It's also the case that global economic conditions are worsening due to the continuation of Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And on top of this, debt was amassed helping people through the COVID pandemic. But it is clear that parts of our mini-budget went further and faster than markets were expecting. So the way we are delivering our mission right now has to change. We need to act now to reassure the markets of our fiscal discipline. I have therefore decided to keep the increase in corporation tax that was planned by the previous government. This will raise £18 billion per year. It will act as a down payment on our full medium-term fiscal plan, which will be accompanied by a forecast from the independent OBR. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy in the medium term. We will control the size of the state to ensure that taxpayers' money is always well spent. Our public sector will become more efficient to deliver world-class services for the British people. And spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. I met the former Chancellor earlier today. I was incredibly sorry to lose him. He is a great friend, and he shares my vision to set this country on the path to growth. Today, I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country. He will deliver the medium-term fiscal plan at the end of this month. He will see through the support we are providing to help families and businesses, including our energy price guarantee that's protecting people from higher energy bills this winter. And he will drive our mission to go for growth, including taking forward the supply-side reforms that our country needs. We owe it to the next generation to improve our economic performance, to deliver higher wages, new jobs, and better public services, and to ease the burden of debt. I have acted decisively today because my priority is ensuring our country's economic stability. As Prime Minister, I will always act in the national interest. This is always my first consideration. I want to be honest, this is difficult, but we will get through this storm, and we will deliver the strong and sustained growth that can transform the prosperity of our country for generations to come.
The Prime Minister at a very short news conference in Downing Street in the last hour or so. A short statement followed by just 3 questions from reporters and answers. Let's go live now to our economics editor Faisal Islam, who's in Washington, which of course is where the former Chancellor was until very recently. He boarded the last plane out of there to come back to London to be sacked. What are your thoughts on the last extraordinary 24 hours, Faisal? And from what you've heard of what Liz Truss said, is it enough, do you think, to calm the financial markets?
Well, Ben, I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like a Chancellor of the Exchequer coming to important international meetings, selling his policies to the world's biggest central bankers, the world's biggest finance ministers, and then being hauled back, as is evident now, hauled back by the Prime Minister on that last plane out of Washington yesterday, cancelling meetings and being fired before, basically via kind of political correspondent Twitter, before he even arrived at number 10. This is absolutely extraordinary stuff. He was obviously defiant when I spoke to him about this. I probably spent more time with him over the past 24 hours than our former Chancellor than anyone else. And it was clear to me that he felt that there wouldn't necessarily have to be a U-turn on the issue of corporation tax. I gave him 4 opportunities to just, if you like, roll the pitch to prepare for some sort of reversal, and he didn't take it. So I concluded from that the now former Chancellor wasn't fully on board with the idea of rowing back on the corporation tax cut, or the not going forward with an increase. And so it doesn't surprise me now that, having got back, he was fired. The reaction in the markets is stable. The U-turn has been received in the way you'd expect, which is borrowing costs versus last week, at a time when we're expecting the Bank of England emergency funding to be withdrawn. Well, it's going in the right direction. Sterling has gone in the right direction. And you heard there a down payment from the Prime Minister Liz Truss, a down payment on fiscal credibility that frankly was lost over the past month. So that is a significant turnaround fiscally. £18 billion a year is what that raises that corporation tax rise. It was Rishi Sunak's corporation tax rise that Liz Truss now will enact, which is an extraordinary thing given the tenor of the arguments that we saw within the Conservative leadership campaign. But it's more than that, actually, and I question this. Although I think the Truss administration starts a slow process of trying to win back economic credibility with this and with a new Chancellor, I do question what it does for Trussonomics, because part of Trussonomics was saying that corporation tax cuts generate their own revenue. You don't raise any money from raising corporation tax. That was the point of Liz Truss's economic policy. So in accepting this argument that it raises £18 billion a year, what is left of her philosophy now for everything else? And so we don't know how much of that survives. And that was the argument which won the Conservative Party leadership campaign. She left in a very interesting position in terms of political credibility, but it's the start of a process as yet unfinished of winning back economic credibility. People I've been talking to here, though, say that damage has been done right now that could last for some time. There's extra premiums on government borrowing for the United Kingdom. United Kingdom looks like a place, things are happening that only normally you'd expect happening in emerging economies. Currency fluctuations every day, borrowing costs going up and down by huge amounts, chancellors coming back on planes and being fired, and we're not entirely sure where policy goes. So it's the start of a process of winning back economic credibility. What it does for her fundamental political arguments about how the economy works is quite another question. Ben.
Faisal, good to see you there in Washington. Thank you very much indeed. That's our economics editor, Faisal Islam, with his assessment. Just to say, by the way, Jeremy Hunt, who has been named as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, we gather he is at home at the moment. We're not yet sure if we're going to hear from him imminently, but we are certainly hoping to. Jeremy Hunt at home, but no comment so far as yet from him on being appointed as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. Let's get reaction now from Sir Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats. So you heard the Prime Minister, a U-turn on corporation tax. Is that enough, do you think?
Well, Liz Truss has trashed the British economy. She's put hundreds of pounds on people's mortgages, and she's humiliated the Conservative government in the eyes of the world. People are angry, they're fed up, and they're worried about the future. But above all, they are furious with this Conservative Party. So I think it's time they had their say. It's time for a general election.
Well, that's not very likely, is it, to be honest? So are you happy now that Jeremy Hunt is the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it looks like a change of direction from the government on the economy?
Well, I look at Jeremy Hunt's track record on the NHS. The NHS and our social care system is in the chaos it is partly because of Jeremy Hunt's record as Secretary of State for Health. And when you look at his ideas on the economy, when he had his two bids to be the Tory leader, he wanted cuts in corporation tax larger than Liz Truss. So I'm afraid I don't have confidence, whether it's on the health service or the economy, with Jeremy Hunt.
What would you have liked to hear from the Prime Minister in that Downing Street statement that you didn't hear in terms of calming the markets? I mean, should she have gone further?
Well, I've already told you I think there should be a general election, because I think that actually would calm the markets. Because
just in terms of economic policy, though?
Well, economic policy is clear. We need a new budget. This budget that they put forward has caused this economic turmoil. It's hurting people. They didn't even get the energy support package right for people and for businesses. So I'm afraid their whole economic policy is wrong. They need to go back to the drawing board. We need to make sure that Britain's tax position is credible in the markets, so interest rates won't go up so high. And that's why Liberal Democrats were the first party to call, for example, for a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies, so we have the money to be able to afford to provide the help for people.
Do you think Liz Truss can survive as Prime Minister?
Well, she shouldn't, but there should be a general election. You know, we can't have yet another unelected Prime Minister foisted on the British people by the Conservative Party. I think people are genuinely angry with the Conservative Party. They should have their say. There should be a general election.
But do you think Tory MPs are going to move against her, though, and possibly bring in Rishi Sunak? That was one of the rumours.
Well, I've heard some of the gossip from around Westminster, often through the BBC's own journalists. I don't think the Prime Minister's position is very strong, and I never thought she'd be a good Prime Minister. But to be honest, I'm reflecting to you what I think many British people feel. When I go on the doorsteps, they're angry with this government. You know, last year, or last 12 months, Liberal Democrats beat the Conservatives in 3 historic by-elections in true blue areas, in Buckinghamshire, in North Shropshire, seat the Tories held for 200 years, in East Devon. And when we were talking to people just back then, before the calamitous mini-budget, people were angry with the Conservatives.
Okay,
they think they're out of touch.
I'm sorry,
we're
out of time. We're out of time, but thank you very much for being with us. You've been watching special coverage here on BBC News of the political crisis in Downing Street.